This is a Geek Leader podcast, and I'm your host, John Arata. This show is all about helping us grow as leaders, become better technologists, and improve our lives both at work and at home. I hope you enjoy the show and learn a lot. Hello, world, and welcome to episode 250 of Geek Leader Podcast. I'm your host, John Arata. Today's sponsor is A2 Hosting. I've been using A2 Hosting solid-state hosting solutions for our website at geekleader.com for many, many years now, and absolutely love their support, their service, and all the features that you get. You get access to cPanel. You get all of the things that you can imagine for a great WordPress experience, including their A2 optimized WordPress, which does extra security checks, extra lockdown. You can lock down your editor file so you can't edit anything inside there. You get alerts whenever there are file changes that are done. You can also do automatic updates, backups, and more with A2 Hosting. So highly recommend it. Go to geekleader.com/A2 to get more information and to sign up for their solid-state, turbocharged speed hosting today. Again, that's at geekleader.com/A2. All right, Geek Leaders, today on the show, I am honored to have Ray Arata with me, and he is the founder of the Better Man Conference. He's also the author of a couple of books that one of them we're going to be talking about a lot today. But he's the author of Wake Up, Man Up, Step Up, and also his newest book, Showing Up. And he's an expert when it comes to diversity and inclusion, and especially working with males. And me and him are both white males, cisgender white males. So we're going to talk a lot about that and give our perspectives of what's going on. So hopefully this is something that's going to be really important and close to the hearts of all of our geek leaders out there, people that want to, become better leaders and better mentors and especially just better leaders to your team, to your family, and to all those around us to make the world a better place. With all that being said, Ray, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
If you don't mind, just tell the audience a little bit about yourself, kind of how you got to where you are today and why this topic of diversity and inclusion and equity when it comes to males is important to you.
Not a problem. And I'll give the relatively quick version. There's three parts to this story. The first I will refer to as the wake up call, which was in 1999. In the span of 6 weeks, the mother of my three children, who was then my wife, said she didn't want to be married to me anymore. She'd been trying to tell me all sorts of things that I just couldn't hear. And then 6 weeks later, one of my business partners, I ran a 401k retirement plan consulting team for high-tech companies and law firms in Silicon Valley. And he went to a rival firm in the middle of the night, which was a betrayal of sorts. And I was not equipped to deal with the 1-2 punch wake-up call. And I didn't turn to booze. I didn't do anything, but I didn't know how to deal with my emotions. And so my emotions got the better of me. And when one day my manager in the financial services industry said, "Ray, I need to talk to you," picking up and calling the syndicate desk and yelling at them is not exactly behavior that you're capable of. And the way he said it was very similar to what my then wife had said. And I realized I needed to do something. So I walked back into his office and I said, "Thanks for saying that. I need to do something." And he handed me a brochure and I looked at it and it said New Warrior Adventure Training, Men's Weekend. And I'm like, what the hell is this? And he smiled and he winks and he goes, "Well, I can't tell you what goes on there, but here, call my wife. It changed my life." So on trust, I was desperate. I was married. No one had divorce in my family, oldest of 3 kids. I just moved into a brand new house, bills to pay. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to go do this weekend. And I show up there and there's 40 men dressed in black. This was in Houston. I got on a plane. And the net of it was an initiation into healthy manhood, a non-denominational, introspective weekend that basically had me see how the pained little boy in me was driving the adult bus. And I was impacting negatively those I loved. And then for my manager, I was doing the same thing at work. So I did this weekend. It woke me up and I started doing, a weekly men's group, what I now call going to the emotional gymnasium, because just because I did one weekend wasn't going to fix me. I had to start practicing that emotional muscle. I was connected to my emotions now. I wasn't afraid to say I was sad or fear. I could connect to my emotions. I could feel. And most importantly, I could stop connecting to the old story in my head about what that meant. So instead of being a little boy surviving like I needed to do when I was younger, I could be an adult, healthy, masculine man. But this required practice. So fast forward, as the hours of the weekends just got their way to 6 or 8 or 10,000 hours, I met a diversity and inclusion consultant who said, Ray, you really have something here. The men in corporate America need to hear from you. But first, I want you to go to a women's leadership event and just listen. So that's the part two. I went to this conference and I'm like, I was the only guy there, and it hit me. And I realized, oh my God, all those times my mom told me how, because she was a daughter in an Italian family and second born, that her older brother got all the rights and privileges because he was a man. And then while my current life partner and wife, Anna, never languaged that, I made an observation that she was one of 8. She's the oldest of 8 in an Italian family. And her youngest brother was running the real estate business. And things were just, the way they were because of the patriarchy. And then finally, my daughter was going to be graduating from Duke with a degree in computer science. So my man in the mirror moment was, and at the prompting of the diversity, equity, inclusion consultant, are you just going to stay in your man church and do these men's weekends? Or are you going to step out and go talk to these men who look like you and sound like you? Well, she called me out and I welcomed it. And I'm like, okay, after talking to all these audiences full of women at women's conferences, I'm like, this is going to take forever. Somebody needs to do something. Somebody needs to do something. Maybe that somebody is me. So I called up a corporate bunch of guys and said, I've got this idea. I want to advance healthy masculinity as a cornerstone of the leadership conversation. I didn't know diddly about DEI. And they said, this sounds like a great idea. So with that, Price Waterhouse, Genentech, Kaiser Permanente, and several other companies were on board. And the first Better Man Conference was born in 2016. I had Michael Kimmel there. I was at his International Masculinities Conference, and I knew Sheryl Sandberg and Jennifer Siebel-Newsom were backstage. I didn't know Roseanne Arquette was there. I walked backstage like I owned the joint and said, my name is Ray Arata. I'm doing this. I need your support. Will you? And Sheryl gave me her card. That's how I got to know Sheryl. That's why I've got the blurb on my book. And she sent her president, Rachel Thomas, to speak at my first conference. So fast forward, here we are now, 13 conferences later. This was all before Time's Up and Me Too. Then they came along, a little bit of wind in the sails. And then COVID and Black Lives Matter created what I call a perfect storm. So now, and this is probably a good place for us to start, all of this attention has now put the attention on the spotlight of the majority of men, because for a long time, the minority of men, the bad apples, the toxic masculinity dudes, they've been controlling the narrative. So I talk to a lot of men. I talk to white men, and they're like, what do I do? Companies are saying, how do we engage men? Because this majority, if they stay silent, they're complicit. So the game we need to play is, how do we meet all those men, depending on how they identify, and support them in rethinking and asking themselves, how do I want to be experienced? Do I want to be a better man? That was the whole point behind the title. So I'll stop there, because there's a lot of places we can go.
Yeah. So I hear you, and I totally understand, especially my wife. I've talked about this before. She's a leader in tech, and I see the struggles that she gets and she has sometimes when it comes to just being heard and being understood. And it's one of those things that I struggle with too, as far as like not being heard and understood, but having empathy and understanding, because I've never been in that place,
Right.
But luckily, at least I say luckily, I have a wife that has, and she's been able to teach me a lot of stuff. And a lot of men don't have that. They haven't had someone that they're really close to that could tell them kind of what it really feels like to be a minority in a situation that's primarily dominated by white men or men in general. So I definitely want to talk about what happens at a Better Man Conference. What happens to a person that goes there, and who are the type of people that go there?
All right. So given that I'm the one who's been up on stage, it's hard for me to answer for them, but here's what I can tell you. We have an intersectional approach, which means we invite all different folks who identify differently to be part of the curated experience. It's not a bunch of white people up there. So we've done a panel with a trans man and just a whole cross section of folk. And in my book, there's even a chapter called "Too Often Excluded Voices of Masculinity," which I interviewed several different men around masculinity and allyship. But with that said, when we create this space, we take people through an experience. The goal is to inspire them, to have them think and feel differently. So what we've done in the past is, in the work we do, we have what we call the Allies Journey. It's our framework that drives everything. It's in the book. It drives the conference. It drives our trainings. So I'll say these steps very quickly. And as I say them, imagine a curated experience, a talk, a breakout room, whatever the case may be, that would dive deeper on these. So the first step I call, in Dude Street Talk, acknowledge our stuff, which basically means acknowledge that I have bias, acknowledge I have privilege, acknowledge these things called my emotions, and acknowledge the man box. The man box is those set of unwritten rules that have historically driven men's behavior, toxic behavior often. Okay, so that's just step one. Step two is listen with empathy and compassion. You mentioned earlier about it's hard for people that identify like you and I to really know what it's like to be in the shoes of other folk. So listening with empathy and compassion invites or opens up the door to presence the lived experiences of others. So the message I would offer, hence the invitation or even a challenge to your male listeners, is don't wait for somebody to let you know that they're having this experience. Get curious. If you choose to put yourself on the path of being an ally, or if you're a director or middle manager and you're looking to go to the next level, be proactive, which means acknowledge your privilege, acknowledge your bias, get curious, start talking to people and ask them what their experiences are like. Now, what's going to happen is you're going to hear someone tell you of some tough goings for them. And if you're a human being with a beating heart, you're not going to like that. What you're going to want to say is, what can I do? That's empathy starting to grow some roots. Yeah. So this is a proactive versus a reactive invitation, because most of us guys, if it's out of sight, out of mind, if you ask us, everything's fine for us.
Yeah. Also, so I want to stop you real quick. I've had some conversations with people where they, you mentioned, that you want to ask, like, how can I help? But there's also a lot of people that will get defensive in this message. Like, well, I'm not like that, and how do you refrain from being defensive if you're one of those defensive types when you're trying to learn and trying to be empathetic, but you struggle with that a little bit?
Could you repeat that question, please? I'm not sure what the question is in there.
Yeah. So how can you be more empathetic whenever you are, trying to learn those situations, but your immediate response is to be defensive? Is to say, I'm not like that. I don't do that. How do you see beyond yourself and see the fact that, okay, maybe you're not like that, but you're also not the norm.
So here's the zinger. Here's the zinger. And here's the zinger, and here's the answer. Yeah. You can listen from the heart, or you can listen from the head. Mm-hmm. Listening from the head has you justify, invalidate, disagree, or worse yet, make it about you. Yeah. That's not what we're looking for. When somebody else is having an experience, we want to center their experience. If you were having a tough day, or I said something that bummed you out or didn't feel good, and the first thing I did after you shared that with me is I said I didn't mean it, or I disagree, does that move you further away from me or closer to me?
Further, yeah.
Further. So the teaching here, the opportunity is to center the lived experience of somebody else. And as you feel inside your want to defend or invalidate, stop. Say, tell me more, or I'm sorry that you feel that way, right? Listening from the heart is all about curiosity. And if we're going to be inside companies and we're human, you're going to say something that might land negatively. We're human. It's what you do when you find out that what you said or didn't say or didn't do impacted, that's going to define you. So how do you want to be experienced? So that would be my invitation, and we'll get to that. So I've given you 2 steps. The third step is take responsibility for the impact, and when necessary, clean it up. And that opens up the door to talk about intention versus impact. Step 4 is commit to new practices and behaviors. So at the Better Man Conference last year, the first conference was on awareness. The second one was on empathy. The third one was on accountability. And the fourth one was on advocacy. So we used those themes to curate the conference. So we had speakers come in, we did panels, some corporate folks to come in and share about those experiences. So when people came to the conference, they're like, oh, this is a deeper dive into these very important concepts that are relevant to me as a director, manager, VP, individual contributor, wherever the case may be. And a lot of tech companies come to the conferences. Intel, Cisco, Oracle, they're all sponsors last year. A whole host of others have sponsored as well.
So being in tech, it's one of those things that like our industry kind of prides itself on trying to be diverse and inclusive. Yet, when you look at like the statistics and you look at like the number of leaders in tech, it's a very small percentage of people that aren't white males. What can, and I've worked on this, I've thought about this problem for many, many years. I teach part-time at Winthrop University, and part of, that when I'm teaching computer science, I have my senior level classes. And I remember 2 years ago, I had a class of 22, and of that class of 22, I had 3 African-Americans and only 2 females. So 20 out of that were males. When I talked to that class, I even asked those 2 females, because we were doing a section on a whole, the title of the class is more like business leadership and technical leadership. And we were talking about, ethics in business and diversity in business and things like that. And I said, so why did you guys choose, software development? Why did you choose, computer science as your major? What's interest in that? And one girl, she's like, well, it was a long journey for me because I actually started out as graphic design and then transferred over because I always wanted to do programming. I said, why didn't you start in programming? And she mentioned that her high school guidance counselor told her that it's really tough for women to get jobs in tech. So don't go that route. So she chose to go a different field. And so how do we as leaders, help down, all the way down to like the middle school level to try to encourage, a greater diversity when it comes to our fields?
We have to change the narrative, and companies are already doing this, that they're investing further down the chain, marketing, helping young girls understand that there's a place for them. They're working all the way through at the high school and the university levels, because more and more women are being interested in computer science and coding. Now, there's historically been a big wall called the wall of men, and the smart companies are investing in changing that narrative. Now, you could do all of that all the way down to the grammar school level and high school level and even at the university. But if those women or more other marginalized folk come out of college and they go into a corporate culture that is not walking the talk, they're going to know. So the number one game that companies are playing now is how to win the war on talent. I mean, you look at what's happened as a result of the pandemic. A bunch of people are not going back to work, and companies are clamoring to get employees. So the story I make up is these companies also have to invest in creating cultures of belonging, which means if still the men in your organization are predominantly in charge, you must put intention and attention on how to engage the men in your org as part of your overall DEI strategy. Do it devoid of shame and blame, meet them where they are, and it's not a one and done thing. So in my book, the last chapter is called The Multi-Year Game Plan. So when I wrote the book, I wrote it for 3 groups of folks: the men in the question, what do I do? The people in leadership positions, how do I engage my men? And then folks that come from marginalized groups, how to support and be supported.
Yeah. So one thing that you know, you mentioned kind of all the things that have happened since you started this conference when it comes to like Me Too and it comes to, Black Lives Matter and all the, controversial things that have happened that that I've used to try to, spur conversation and have more conversation. Cause I think the only way things get better is to talk about it. And if you keep it
Exactly.
to yourself, you're not going to get anything's better. And I'll share some of my experiences with that, and maybe you can help me tell me what I did wrong, what I can do better, and maybe what I did just fine. I don't know, but I reached out. I know when Black Lives Matter, I reached out to all the African Americans on my team, and just to see, is there anything I can do? Is there anything you want to talk about? Some were very open, and I had hours of conversations about different things, about how they feel right now, what life has been like for them before this, after this, during this, and all that stuff. And then I had others that says, no, everything's fine. Didn't want to talk about it. And I just left that alone. I wasn't sure if I should, ask more. Should I press more? Should I just leave them alone? Should I don't know. I don't know what to do, if I'm doing things right or wrong, but I did make myself available. And I think that's, step one, but what is the next steps for things like that?
Well, actually, I want to address your question from two different angles. One of the things I learned a long time ago around the work of being an ally and an inclusionary leader is not to burden those that don't look like me to teach me. And to be very present to that, which means, and they will tell you, you all need to go do your work with each other. So men need to do the work with men, white folk need to do the work with white folk. Okay, so there's something about that. There's a lot of books to read, and getting together and learning. Then you can go back and just say, hey, I learned this. Do you have any feedback? Something along those lines. And then when you and I, as cisgendered white men, we have a responsibility to educate, call in, and occasionally call out other men and bring them along. And one of the ways we can grow our numbers is if we step into a little bit of vulnerability.
Yeah.
And we share what we've experienced with other men and encourage them to get on the path. That's really the only way that all of this can be advanced, because there's a lot of fatigue by marginalized folks. I mean, just being who they are every day, they're burdened. If you and I talk to the women in our life and we ask them, we'd be like, oh my God, we had no idea. Okay, now that we know what that's like and we look ourselves in the mirror, what do we want to do with that? What can we do with that to level the playing field?
Yeah, I know there's several things that I struggle with in life, but one of them would be that my wife tells me that I mansplain too much. So I try to stop doing that. I try to focus on the fact that, and when I hear it from her perspective, and she talks about other people at work that do this and how she'll say something in a meeting and nobody reacts to it. And then someone else will say almost the exact same thing that she said, but that's coming from a man. They listen to it. And I'm like, do I do that? Do I ignore the feedback from women? And, I try to really hyper focus on a lot of things and try to, I remember one time I was at a conference and I was speaking about leadership, and I made the horrible mistake of saying the guys on my team. And I meant the people on my team, because my team is mostly female. And it honestly never occurred to me that guys was even a masculine term. I've always used that my entire life.
Yep.
And, then I noticed, so I got called out on that, and I started focusing on never saying the word you guys, never saying guys. Yeah. And then I go to my daughter's softball team, all women, all girls. And the coach is female. And the coach is like, hey, guys, come over here. Hey, guys, this. You guys need it. I'm like, what the heck? Like, I know, they're girls.
We have to just put that aside. And for your listeners, I just opened up to my book to page 153 on mansplaining. And I feel compelled to read the impact of it and how it lands. And then
yes, please do.
So this type of explaining is condescending. Imagine if the roles were reversed and a woman went on a rant explaining something you already had knowledge about. How would you feel? Would you form a judgment of her? Would you stop listening? Would you be insulted? So, a couple of tips on changing your propensity to mansplain. Number one, work on noticing your desire to explain something. Ask yourself, why do I feel the need to explain this when I haven't been asked to do so? Since women have as much knowledge as men, you only need to offer your knowledge when you are asked to do so. So that's probably the biggest one. And then here's what happens if you see somebody else do it. Notice others who mansplain. If you see this behavior happen in meetings or elsewhere in your workplace or organizations, take a moment to evaluate. Did she ask for the explanation? If not, check in and ask her if any explanation was needed. Let her tell you. You can pull the man aside later instead of embarrassing him and explain what you observed, why his behavior is inappropriate, and how it impacts women. I would throw in there, say something like, hey, I've got some feedback for you based on what I saw. Are you open? Mm-hmm. We hope he says yes, right?
Yeah.
Again, being a good ally means calling out behavior when you see it. Consult the giving feedback model in chapter 6.
Yeah. And also right below that, I think it's where you mentioned, you talk about saying everyone instead of guys. And
exactly.
And then that's what reminded me of my talk, several years ago where I said that, and it didn't even occur to me at the time, but it's one of those things that, but now when I hear it is like, I hate this word too, but it kind of triggers me a little bit. Like when I hear, like I mentioned at my daughter's softball game, they were saying, I'm like, stop saying that, but I don't know. I'm getting off on a tangent.
Listen, the work of becoming awake is work. That's why they call it work. Mm-hmm. But I will tell you, the more you put your own intention on in being intentional in your language and what you say, the freer you'll become, and the more people will trust you and follow you as a leader. Because leaders have a lot of power, and we want to create safety around us. Because at the end of the day, we want those around us, regardless of how they identify, to bring their whole selves to work. That's real leadership, when people feel safe enough to totally contribute. If we don't, and they're like backtracking because of microaggressions by you or other people, you're getting 30, 40, 50% of those people. And that's not good.
Yeah. And that's also why I think, like, as a leader, I think it's important whenever you learn something new, like I learned about calling a group of people, you guys, that I need to, and maybe you correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I feel like I need to, address it and tell people like, yeah, I messed up. I didn't know this. I've learned this. And hopefully you guys can learn from me that, this is how we address groups, going forward. And that's why I talk about it on the podcast. This is a public thing. There's going to be, thousands of people listening to this episode. And I want to make sure that they know that, yeah, I mess up too. Everybody messes up. And when I do, I want to make sure I own it and put it out there so that we can all learn from those mistakes and correct our behavior going forward.
So what's your question?
I don't have a question. I'm just having a conversation.
Yeah, I was listening to that going, okay.
Making a statement more than a question.
Okay, perfect.
So tell me about, why you decided to write a book called Showing Up, and what does showing up mean to you, and how can men show up?
So when I wrote my first book, I was challenged by a guy who said I was playing a one-to-one game, and I need to play a one-to-many game. And a book was a way to get the message out further. And I had been getting lots of feedback that what I had to say had some value, and I had all of it in my head. So when he said, you need to write a book, and I went for it. And I got all the stuff out of my head, created some order, and wrote the book, coming from my heart, mission driven. And so when after 7 or 8 years of being on this journey around gender equality, getting the He for She award from UN Women, I was at that point again where people kept asking me, what do I do? And one of my coaches said, Ray, I think it's time for you to write the book. And this was early on in the pandemic, and it made a ton of sense to me. So I made the decision and I realized a lot of my healthy masculinity work, my men's work, I was reconstituting into bite-sized pieces into the allyship and leadership conversation. And I had a decent following, and so the time was right for me to write the book. So showing up, I want to credit my former partner, Chris Bell. She came up with the title, and it was very apropos in that we need men to get off the sidelines and show up. So I knew that showing up, and it was kind of funny, my first book was Wake Up, Man Up, Step Up. Show up is a natural catchy progression. It's in alignment. People resonate with it. And if I really looked at what I was trying to put out there, I want men to become effective allies in the workplace. So the lane was right there. And that's how I came about writing the book. And, some people write books, as a calling card. I wrote it because it needed to come out. It was just another thing that I knew I needed to do.
Well, I'm glad you did. I think it's a really good thing. I have one question. How can we as men be allies without going too far? You know what I mean? I feel like there's a pendulum that you get in there, because I know when I talk to my
too far? What do you mean by too far?
Yeah. So when I talk to my wife a lot about, how she's treated at work, she says it's a terrible experience whenever a boss gives her something or gives her something easier because she's a female, because they want to make sure the female succeeds. They promote someone just because they're a female. She says that is a more derogatory and a worse feeling than not being promoted because you're a female. So how do we balance being fair and equity and equal versus giving something to someone that doesn't deserve it?
So there's a couple ways I can answer that. There's data that shows when a woman applies for a job, if she has four of the five qualifications, she won't apply because she doesn't have that fifth one. Mm-hmm. That usually speaks to confidence, which is an issue for a lot of women. And men, if they have 0 to 1 qualifications, they'll put their hand up, say, "Put me in, coach, I can do this." So part one of my answer is, as men, we need to be aware of and do what I call push, promote, and protect. Push the woman by saying, "You can do this. You've got all of the qualifications. You're a talented person," and step into and bring your contributions forward. You can promote them in your network and let other people know that this woman or marginalized person is very capable. And when no one's looking, you can protect them from some of the bad apples. And so there's a lot of things that we can do. Now, for the woman who's in that situation, that's a difficult situation, because you've got a guy either trying to do right, but he's not, or he's got blinders on. And all you can really do is to do your best, but find another ally in the org, or, have a conversation with that man saying, "Listen, I appreciate everything you've done so far, and I want to earn this on merit, right? And I want feedback, just like you give anybody else. So it's like, if I'm not bringing it the way you need it, let me know." The way you would say it to a guy, like, if you're not cutting it or you're missing here, just because I'm a woman doesn't mean I can't hear the same feedback.
Yeah, bingo. I think that's exactly right. I think a lot of people will try to, curve their, not say things the same way just because of who they're talking to. But I feel like you're right. As long as you're a genuine, authentic person, you need to give that same feedback. You need to, but also, I agree with what I've seen the same studies where it talks about how women won't apply if they don't have all the qualifications, whereas a man will most likely apply if they have one of the 5 qualifications that you mentioned. So you got to be, fair about, helping push them and say, "Look, you've got this." Just because they ask for these, 5 recommended qualifications, you got 3 out of the 5, doesn't mean you can't do the job and learn the other 2 on the way. You've got to at least give it some effort and try really hard. And we know you can do it, and push them along and help them along. And let them understand that the competition is going to be people that are applying with less skills, because that's what we guys do sometimes,
Right. Yeah. And here's the other thing. Sometimes I hear from men that they are afraid that they're not going to get a job because they're a white male, or that they did. Now, there's a lot of ways I can respond to that. I can be empathic and say, "I'm sorry you didn't get it." I could say, sometimes in life, a certain amount of us, unfortunately, need to go through a phase where we may be getting the short end of the stick. Meaning, the way the pendulum has been swinging with Time's Up and Me Too, there's been a lot of carnage out there. And so I could then say, imagine what it's been like for women or people of color for all these years. That might not make you feel better. But then the last question is okay, all this is happening. There's a new choice you can make. You can step on the path of becoming a valuable white male cisgendered leader who exudes inclusivity and allyship. So if you want to make a name for yourself, cut from the herd, start learning some of this stuff, because then you will go from being one of the many to one of the few. This is the kind of talk I have with my younger son, with my sons. I talk to them about this stuff, and I said, listen, you can't change the current narrative that's going on out there, but what you can do is change how you be inclusive, center others, learn about your blind spots, right? Work hard. It'll come.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's extremely important. And also, one thing I want to mention just before we finish up this talk is that, when we're talking about inclusivity, especially in tech, it's not just the same things you see in a lot of other fields when it comes to, women's a huge one because there's a very minority women that are in tech, but there's also ageism. That's really a big deal when it comes to tech. And, when I look at my fields, there's not a lot of resumes coming from, or a lot of people getting hired that are older. And, we've got to be sure we're fair and not just judge people because they, graduated college in the 80s. We want to make sure that that's not a problem. If they have the skills, they have the skills. And there is a lot of bias in that realm as well that we miss out on.
So one of the things I think is a big miss, and hopefully an opportunity at some point, and I borrow from my men's work, where in the men's work arena, there's a place for elders. And the elders have a lot of wisdom and contribution. Now, leaders, guys my age, and for those of your listeners who can't see me, I'm going to be 59 next month. And so one of the things I've learned about leadership is the older I get, the less I do. It's the more I be. And the mark of a real great leader is how I empower others around me, right? And so the corporate America hasn't figured this one out yet around how to tap into the aging workforce and to create a dialogue and an understanding and a contextual alignment around here's their place, right? And this is a leadership stepladder, if you will. So the ageism piece right now, it's kind of in its infancy, in that people are afraid they're going to get aged out. And I would redo the narrative saying, how do we tap into that so that they can learn to support the younger people that are coming along? Imagine what that could be like.
Yeah, right. No, I think, there's a lot of wisdom, and I gained so much from my leadership from talking to people that have been there before, and they blazed these trails before, and I can learn from their mistakes. I can learn from their successes and get that information. And hopefully people will do the same thing for me someday too.
Absolutely.
Well, Ray, man, I really appreciate having you on. Thank you so much for getting a copy. I got a copy of the book before you came on. I really appreciate that, and had a chance to go through it. And I just really appreciate you and what you're doing for all those out there, especially giving a positive spin to masculinity that's out there. Let us know that we can be allies for those around us, and I really appreciate it.
Awesome. So if your listeners are wondering how do they get the book, we have a nice bonus situation set up. If they go to showingupbook.com, they can, by buying the book, they can also get a virtual ticket to one of our Better Man conferences. We'll have one in June and we'll have one in November. And so we've made that bonus to make it easy for them to get the book and get the ticket. Now, if any of them are in a company that they see value in terms of what we're talking about for their team or for their company, I always talk to, the guys, go talk to your diversity, equity, and inclusion department. Say, what kind of training or what can we do? I've heard about this thing called the Better Man Conference. So if they go to bettermanconference.com, sign up for the newsletter, that's one thing they can do, because then we'll let them know about our Showing Up series, which is a once a month call that we're going to be doing starting in, I believe, March. And then they could also go to rayarata.com and do the drop down for bulk orders. So if they're in a corporate position we set things up that you buy 100 or 500 books, whatever the case may be. I'll do a keynote. So or just reach out to me at ray@bettermanconference.com.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'm going to link all that up in the show notes at geeklydoor.com. I'll link to the book, to showingupbook.com, where you can get it there, and the Better Man Conference. So, Ray, really appreciate having you on. And, again, thanks so much. Really appreciate it. If you enjoyed that episode, please leave a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. I'd greatly appreciate that. And also, don't forget to check out merch. We have some T-shirts that I've designed that are on at geekleader.com. You can click on the merchandise section there and check that out. And also, don't forget about the books from our guests. So if you like this guest and other guests that have written books, please go ahead and check that out at geekleader.com. I would greatly appreciate it, and I'm sure they would too.